So a real classic game we saw today in the Tech Mahindra League between these two greats, Magnus Carlsen, former world champion, and Jan Nepomniachtchi, two-time world championship challenger. Now the picture in the thumbnail, that was Magnus's face at the end of this game. Why? Well, you're gonna see. And then I'll bring you a clip of the players analysing after so you can see that one for yourself. Now Magnus here was playing with black, Jan with white. Let's check this one out. So e4 on the board, and Magnus goes for this fighting Sicilian, and c3 now from Nepo. So this is known as the Alapin, preparing d4, and after Magnus goes e5, kind of looks an ugly pawn structure on the face of it, you know, creating this hole here kind of thing, but it's kind of moving it more back into a king's pawn game in a way. You're clamping on this d4 push, gaining space. We get knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, looks at this hole, also down here as we'll see, and after knight f6, we get some knight g5 stuff on the board. So some fried liver reminiscent stuff in the air, right? You know, reminds me of that Hikaru and Fabi game recently. Final round of Norway chess, huge drama. I'll link that one at the end in case you missed it. Now, what does Magnus do to respond to the threat? Well, d5 breaks the line of the bishop. We get pawn captures. Now, in those kind of king's pawn positions, you normally get the knight chucking out here, but things are a bit different here. So Magnus can capture that pawn. And interestingly, the top line of the engine here is to actually take on f7. Wait, is it here? Yeah, here, sorry. No, c times d4, sorry, takes on d4 first, as was played in the game. Nepo went queen b3, but the top line of the engine here is to play king knight f7. Sorry, muddling my lines. And then we could have had something like this. Now, presumably Magnus knew his theory, knew what he was doing, but we didn't go down that line because after Magnus captured here on pawn d4 from Nepo, well then Nepo went queen b3. So pressuring this knight and also this pawn here. So Magnus goes bishop e6 to cover that one, but it allows Nepo to chop here, mangle the pawn structure, and pick up the bishop pair. And this is really what Jan's now playing for, because he wins back a pawn, pressures that knight, Magnus defends, but he's only temporarily restoring the pawns. As we'll see here, Magnus soon goes a pawn up, but Nepo's got the bishops, because Nepo doesn't want to take here and give Magnus this kind of grip in the centre. Instead, he holds off, plays for initiative. So castle's now played. Magnus goes queen d7, doesn't go grabbing any pawns just yet. He's got to sort out his king. Nepo keeps the queens on. We get bishop e7 developing and bishop b3 nudging back and clearing some room for that queen to re-enter the game on the king side. We get castles played, now queen d3, and Magnus goes knight a5. So going after this deadly light squared bishop, black's got no opposite number, so that's a dangerous piece. So Nepo keeps it on the board with bishop d1. Bishop c2 looked way the more logical move, you know, pressuring here, and then either knight f6 or g6 were playable. Okay, Nepo wants to bring it to this diagonal instead. And now Magnus plays a slightly strange move. You know, this rook looks quite well placed on this open f file. The computer's order of the day is maneuvering one of those two knights, but he goes rook f to d8. We can see there's a lot going on down that d file, so it makes some sense. Bishop f3 from Nepo, and now pawn takes on c3. The knight recaptures, and we get this liquidation going on. So the queens, they come off the board. Rook recaptures. You're going into an endgame against Magnus. The endgame go. Good luck to you, Jan. But after rook captures here, bishop b2, although he's a pawn down, he's got those bishops. These pawns are a bit of a mess. The knight is sidelined. You know, you show grandmasters this of this level, they'd say, yeah, roughly level. And indeed, the computer gives it zeros, right? Well, let's see what happens in this game because it gets interesting. So rook c5 played, covering the e pawn. Now rook a to d1. We see a pair of rooks coming off the board. Just before I show this, by the way, watch how the black rook captures. So it's got that kind of whoosh thing going on. The chess.com team have kind of changed things slightly. The numbers at the side here look slightly different. The pieces look slightly different. They kind of wobble when you move them. It goes white around the square. You know, they've just been updating the UI a bit. Okay, different. Anyway, knight c4. We see that bishop attacked. It bounces into c3. And now this is a nice tricky move from Magnus. He pushes pawn e4, spots this opportunity to try and liquidate one of those double pawns. Really astute, because the idea is if you capture, then there's knight d6. This is the other thing, the way they grey out the board is slightly different now. So after knight d6, both bishops attacked, and this isn't good for white, better for black. So the pawn not captured, bishop d4 played by Jan, and this is also a tricky move. Because if you capture on f3, looks like it should be good for black, you know, picking up here 2 minors for a rook. Well, the sting at the end of the tail is rook c1, and you're losing one of these pieces by force. That's then better for white. So what we see played here is rook a5 from Magnus. The bishop can now take the pawn with impunity, and Magnus takes on a2, still keeping a pawn ahead. g3 played, gives the king some room. Knight d2 pressures the bishop on e4, it jumps into c6, and pawn a5, Magnus starts running that passer on the queen side. King g2, king f7, bishop c3 pressures that knight, and I really like this journey. We see knight c4, another little threat in the air of knight e3 check, picking up then this rook on d1. You know, the pawn is pinned by this one here. So rook d7 now from Jan, gets out of dodge, puts the pressure on this bishop here, and knight e3 check played anyway. King f3, and this is just a really tricky move from Magnus now. He's on fire in this game. Does he move his knight? No, he goes rook a3, pressuring this bishop and setting up some nasty x-ray stuff. So for example, if you take here, with the idea being that if king takes, then rook takes here with check, you've won a pawn. Well, you can't actually do that because the problem is this in-between move, no, not that one, this in-between move of knight f5, opening up the check and then winning the bishop on the next move. So what do we see instead? Well, bishop b2, dropping back, hitting the rook, rook b3, hitting the bishop once again, and Jan now goes for this exchange of minor pieces, and rook a7 coming behind the passed pawn. So Magnus picks up here, Jan takes here. And now if you show this to any kind of super GMs, right, or GMs for that matter, whatever, strong players, they'd be like, how is black ever going to do some pressure here or make some pressure here? Because you've got 3 on 2 pawns, but it's opposite coloured bishops, you know, the kings are both well placed. Well, what Magnus's idea is to push this 2 on 1 here, try and generate this passed pawn. So he starts with pawn h5, rook a6 from Nepo, so pressures that weak light squared pawn on e6, and he's got this idea now of bishop b5 to c4, add the pressure here. So Magnus goes bishop d6, blunts out this rook, also looks down here and prepares to bring the king. We get bishop b5, hits that bishop on d6 with the rook, so king e7 covers, and now Jan plays such a logical move, continuing his plan, bishop c4, but it's not precise. What he should do here is rook a7 check to fight against Magnus's ideas, because after king f6, you then have to find the follow-up of bishop e8. I mean, this is really not easy stuff. But the idea is, now if you go g5, looking to generate that passer, then you can go king e4. Again, just deep stuff, right? You know, you're literally giving a pawn. What's that all about? Well, then there's check. The king has to come here, and then you go like this. Discovered check, picking up the bishop. So that one's no good if you want to play for any kind of win as black. So you wouldn't take this pawn on g3. Instead, you could try, say, g4 to give the king a square on g5, but then still check. The king can now go to g5, yes, but you check from g7. Now, if you come back, you're just repeating moves. If you go to h6, then you check from here, again supported by the bishop. King goes and rook g5, hitting this one. If you come back, you're just repeating. And if you take here, well, then there's this kind of liquidation. I mean, as ever, the computer, you know, just finds its way through all of this stuff, crunches it. These are not easy concepts to find, you know, rook a7, bishop e8. But that was the way to go. But what Jan did was bishop c4. You see that eval bar go, because now g5 comes on the board and e4 also doesn't help the white cause. Now there is a logical idea, which is push e5, distract this bishop, and then crash through on e6. So Magnus responds to this now with rook c2, that bishop drops back, and then he goes rook c5, covering the e5 square from that push, preparing to run this h-pawn. So king e3 now played, looking to enter to d4, support e5 or something of that effect, also pressure this rook. Magnus cracks on, we get pawn captures, pawn recaptures, rook a7 check, brings the rook behind the passed pawn, but Magnus pushes on anyway with pawn to h3, and he's setting a trap. Now I should run back, you'll see the eval bar go. The computer actually wanted to start with rook c3 check, but it's pretty deep stuff. What Magnus does here looks the most logical, because if you capture, then there's this check, the king goes and you pick up the rook. This is the trick that Magnus is playing for, but what Jan had in response was a way to draw this game, but he gets the order just slightly wrong. He should have taken here on e6 with the bishop. Now why would you give up bishop for pawn? Well, after king captures, then you can throw in this king d4, and actually you can't save this pawn anymore, because if you push it onto h2 supported by the bishop, well then we simply take. Now this isn't simple tactics, but once you get to that bit it's simple enough. Bishop captures, you take the rook, and this is a drawn endgame. And coming back here, after king d4, if instead of pushing the pawn, you save this rook, saying, okay, take the pawn again, I dare you, because I'm going to check, drive you back, still win your rook. Well, the trick is that just before you capture the pawn here, you flick in a check. The king goes, then you take the pawn. Now if black checks, you can step up the board, the king's not got that opposition and shouldering you out. So some deep stuff, but that was the way to go for Jan. But he goes king d4 immediately, same idea, but now Magnus can flick in rook c2. Pick up a tempo here, he's not obliged to push that one. Now Nepo takes on e6 with the bishop, but just not in the right order, because bishop e5 check now comes. I mean, still, if you take here, the same draw is happening with check, rook takes here, you know, that kind of thing. This is a draw, but because you don't have to do that, Magnus first checks, the king goes, he checks from behind, and now he pushes that pawn. No more tricks for white. You can't just give up a rook and take that pawn here. So instead, bishop g4 played. Covers the rook from coming to the back rank, supporting the promotion. Also covers f3. So rook f2 now played, looking here, looking here. We get rook h3 on the board, supporting that bishop move. But now the king just marches in, encourages it. It happens, but bang. Magnus just chops it off. Rook captures, makes a queen, gives the bishop in the process, but he knows this endgame should be lost. How's his technique? Well, the king starts coming in, and now there's a whole series of moves here, right? As you can imagine, this goes on quite a bit. Magnus starts giving that king the runaround, checking, sometimes not checking, just creating the threat, but he slowly just kind of edges in this king. White is helpless to all of these checks and maneuvering moves. We'll see the king slide all the way up the board, and soon we reach a position here where Nepo is obliged to push the pawn, because the rook is protecting it from this queen's attack. But if you try and keep protecting it with, say, rook e8, well then king d7 comes, check first, king d7, and now the rook's got to give ground, and then this pawn's going to be dropping anyway, so on and so forth. You know, eventually the queen wins out the day. So what does Nepo do here? Well, he pushes the pawn. We see king d5, pawn push again, and the king starts marching round into the danger zone. Rook g7 hits that queen. By the way, if rook e8 is a different try, well then king f6, and this is obviously looking terrible. If rook e7, then there's queen h5, and you just start creating these kind of zugzwangs here, you know, white just running out of moves to stay in the game. So what we see instead was rook g7, but now check. The rook blocks, queen check, king goes, king takes the pawn, and after rook f1, check, king goes, and queen b5. This is just such nice technique from Magnus. The rook is hit, and if you go rook e1 check, simply king f6. The queen still covers the checking square, and now after king g8, you can go check, and you drive the king into the corner, check, king back, and you get this kind of mate, you know, just laddering the way into the position. Really nice stuff. So the rook comes back to stay in connection with the king. Queen h5 played, king e7 check, king f6, and here we see resignation from Jan Nepomniachtchi. Why? Well, it's mate in 4. Say you go rook g7, well then there's queen h6, creating this pin. I mean, what else to even say or try? If you do this, then yeah, queen f7 mate, so you can't leave this rank. If you come here, then there's this mate down here. So yeah, you're basically threatening two kind of mates. It's just impossible really, nothing you can do. So Carlsen takes the win, and this was the reaction then after the game. So grimacing at some variations. He can be kind of humble like that, to be fair. He never just kind of lords it over his opponents.
A huge victory for the Balin Alaskan Knights as they get the points their way to move up the leaderboard. Magnus and Jan Nepomniachtchi, two players who've known each other since they were kids.
Right.
The big battle here, have played a world championship match against each other. And this one, Magnus takes it. He looked at his team and he's disappointed.
Yeah, last time he lost, I think the last match, he lost his game, but his team won. And now he won his game, but his team lost. I guess he's not having all the happy moments there for himself.
I hope you enjoyed that one. If you want to see a classic encounter between Hikaru Nakamura and Fabiano Caruana, round 13 of Norway chess, check out the video on screen. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.